History remembers the Middle Ages in costumes, stone castles silhouetted against sunsets, knights in polished armor, noble kings dispensing justice beneath banners and crowns. But this image was never meant to be accurate. It was meant to be comforting, because the real medieval world was not built on honor or heroism. It was built on fear, scarcity, and control. And to understand it honestly, we must strip away the romance that later centuries carefully painted over its bones. Medieval life did not begin with adventure. It began with birth into limitation. Where you were born determined almost everything about your future: your labor, your food, your rights, your chances of survival. Mobility was not rare. It was almost non-existent. For most people, the village they were born into was the village they would die in. And death came often. Infant mortality was not tragic, it was expected. Childhood was brief, harsh, and unsentimental. By the age modern societies associate with play, medieval children were already working, carrying water, tending animals, learning trades that would grind their bodies down before they reached middle age, if they reached it at all. There was no concept of potential, only usefulness. Life expectancy numbers are misleading. It wasn't that everyone died young, it was that death hovered constantly, waiting for a misstep, an infection, a bad harvest, or the wrong season. Disease did not arrive dramatically. It lingered in open sewers, in contaminated wells, in livestock living under the same roof as humans. Medical knowledge existed, but it was constrained by superstition, religious doctrine, and inherited error. Treatments often harmed more than they healed. Bloodletting, purging, and prayers replaced anything resembling evidence-based care. Pain was normalized. Suffering was interpreted as spiritual correction. The medieval world functioned on a simple truth: most people were expendable. Feudalism was not a mutual agreement, it was a hierarchy enforced by necessity. Peasants did not serve lords because they believed in loyalty. They served because refusing meant starvation, punishment, or expulsion from land they depended on to live. Freedom, as a concept, applied only to a narrow elite, and even they were constrained by obligation, by violence, by constant political threat. Castles were not fairy tale homes. They were military installations, cold, damp, dark, designed to withstand sieges, not comfort inhabitants. Lords and nobles lived surrounded by guards, not because they were admired, but because assassination was common. Power was fragile, and everyone knew it. Justice was not blind, it was selective. Laws applied differently depending on status. A noble's crime could be resolved with fines. A peasant's mistake could cost a hand, an eye, or a life. Public punishment was entertainment. Executions were communal events. Fear was not hidden, it was displayed. Religion dominated every aspect of life, not as comfort, but as structure. The church did not merely guide belief. It regulated time, behavior, sexuality, knowledge, and thought. To question doctrine was not intellectual curiosity, it was treason against reality itself. Hell was more vividly described than heaven, because fear was the most effective tool of compliance. Medieval society did not need constant surveillance. People internalized authority. They feared divine punishment more than earthly law, and that fear kept systems intact for centuries. But beneath the surface of obedience, something darker existed. Resentment, desperation, quiet defiance. Peasant revolts did not happen because people suddenly became brave. They happened because suffering crossed a threshold. And when it did, the response was swift and brutal. Entire villages erased, examples made. History often portrays the Middle Ages as a necessary stepping stone toward progress. But for those living inside it, there was no sense of trajectory, no promise of improvement, only endurance. This is the truth medieval life tried to hide. Most people were not living. They were surviving systems designed without them in mind. And yet, despite the brutality, civilization persisted. Not because the system was humane, but because humans adapted to inhuman conditions. That adaptation came at a cost that shaped psychology, culture, violence, and belief in ways that still echo today. Because medieval life did not end when the era did. Its structures evolved, its fears modernized, its lessons were buried intentionally. And in the next chapter, we will uncover the foundation of medieval suffering, the daily reality of hunger, labor, and exhaustion that defined ordinary existence. Medieval life was not organized around dreams, ambition, or self-fulfillment. It was organized around bread, not metaphorically, literally. Bread determined whether a family lived or died. It dictated labor schedules, social unrest, religious rituals, and political stability. A bad harvest did not mean inconvenience. It meant starvation, displacement, and mass death. And bad harvests were common. The medieval economy was brutally simple. Most people produced food, almost none controlled it. A peasant's year revolved around exhausting cycles of planting, tending, and harvesting, often on land they did not own, for crops they would not fully keep. The best portions went to the Lord, a portion went to the church, taxes took another share. What remained was survival rations. Hunger was not episodic, it was chronic. Medieval diets were monotonous and nutritionally fragile. Bread, porridge, and thin ale formed the backbone of daily consumption. Meat was rare for commoners. Fresh vegetables were seasonal. Protein deficiencies were widespread. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Disease followed. Famine did not arrive as a sudden catastrophe. It crept. People diluted grain with bark, grass, or ground bones. Livestock were slaughtered early, removing future food sources. Seed grain was eaten, ensuring the next year would be worse. And when desperation peaked, societies crossed lines they never wanted to remember. Cannibalism during severe famines was not myth. It was documented, then buried. Work offered no escape. Labor was relentless, physical, and dangerous. Farming tools were crude. Injuries were common. A broken limb could mean permanent disability or death by slow neglect. There were no safety nets. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. The romantic image of the medieval peasant as simple but content is one of history's most persistent lies. Contentment requires security. Medieval peasants had none. Even skilled laborers, blacksmiths, millers, masons lived precariously. One failed contract, one illness, one political disruption could destroy a livelihood. Guilds provided limited protection, but they also enforced rigid hierarchies and punished deviation. Innovation was risky. Stability was prized over improvement. Money itself was unstable. Coinage varied wildly. Barter dominated rural life. Inflation followed wars. Debasement of currency by rulers was common, quietly transferring wealth upward. Economic literacy was non-existent for most people. Exploitation thrived in that ignorance. Violence underpinned the entire system. Not constant open warfare, but the threat of it. Lords maintained armed retainers. Castles controlled trade routes. Power was enforced through the knowledge that resistance would be met with force. Revolts were rare not because people were loyal, but because the cost of failure was annihilation. The church reinforced this economic order. Poverty was reframed as virtue. Suffering became spiritually meaningful. Wealth was promised not in this life, but the next. This belief system stabilized inequality more effectively than armies ever could. But cracks were always forming. Hunger makes people think. Food shortages triggered migrations, riots, heretical movements, and eventually, revolutions. Economic pressure was the silent engine behind medieval unrest, even when history blames ideology or faith. Medieval rulers understood this instinctively. Control the grain and you control the population. Granaries were guarded like fortresses. Bread prices were politically sensitive. A spike in cost could ignite cities. Bread was policy. Hunger was governance. This is the dark truth beneath medieval economics. The system was never designed to eliminate suffering. It was designed to manage it. And in managing suffering, medieval society perfected tools of control that would echo far beyond its era into modern labor systems, economic dependency, and institutional inequality. Because once a population is kept hungry enough to be compliant but fed enough to survive, it will endure almost anything. In the next chapter, we move from hunger to fear, from labor to law, from survival to punishment. Medieval justice was not designed to be fair. It was designed to be seen. Law in the Middle Ages functioned less as a system of moral balance and more as a public performance of power. Justice was not meant to correct behavior. It was meant to deter disobedience through terror. And terror, when ritualized, becomes culture. Crime in medieval society was broadly defined. Stealing bread to survive and stealing property to enrich oneself were treated with similar severity. Intent mattered less than disruption. What threatened order was punished harshly. Trials were rarely investigations. They were confirmations. Evidence as we understand it barely existed. Witnesses could be coerced. Confessions were extracted. Superstition replaced procedure. Truth was not discovered, it was declared. Ordeals were considered legitimate legal tools. If accused, you might be forced to carry hot iron, plunged into boiling water, or thrown into a river. Survival indicated innocence. Injury indicated guilt. God was believed to intervene. He rarely did. Torture was not a last resort. It was routine. Pain was seen as a purifier. Confession under agony was accepted as truth. The body became a legal instrument, one that could be broken in service of order. Punishments were intentionally grotesque. Hands chopped off for theft, eyes gouged for defiance, branding for dishonor, execution for repetition. These acts were not hidden, they were staged. Public squares became theaters of fear. Children were brought to watch. Because fear learned early lasts longer, executions were social events. Vendors sold food. Crowds gathered. Justice was communal participation in state violence. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens when you cross the line. But lines were never clear. Laws varied by region, ruler, and moment. What was permitted one year could be punishable the next. This unpredictability was not a flaw, it was a feature. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Nobles were rarely subjected to the same brutality. Status insulated them. Punishment was a language spoken primarily to the poor. Justice reinforced hierarchy. It reminded people of their place. Even accusations alone could ruin lives. Being suspected of witchcraft, heresy, or moral corruption invited social death. Once labeled, innocence became irrelevant. Fear spread faster than facts. Women were particularly vulnerable. Their bodies, behavior, and reputations were constantly policed. Deviating from social expectations could trigger punishment disguised as moral correction. Midwives, healers, and independent women were especially targeted. Long before the infamous witch hunts formalized this violence, the law did not protect the vulnerable. It disciplined them. But the most chilling aspect of medieval justice was not its brutality. It was its normalization. Violence became familiar. Public pain became spectacle. Cruelty became routine. When violence is ritualized, empathy erodes. And when empathy erodes, control becomes effortless. This culture of punishment shaped medieval psychology profoundly. People learned not just to obey, but to self-police, to suppress dissent before it reached thought. Fear moved inward. This internalized control allowed medieval systems to persist with minimal enforcement. The threat alone was enough. Yet fear is unstable. It cracks under pressure. As populations grew, cities expanded, and ideas spread, the theater of fear began to lose its grip. People started questioning not just authority, but the morality of its violence. Those questions would eventually transform law itself. but not before centuries of blood were spilled in the name of order. In the next chapter, we descend into the deepest darkness of medieval fear, death itself, and how society learned to live with it everywhere. In the medieval world, death was not an event. It was an environment. It did not arrive quietly at the end of long lives. It lingered in streets, homes, churches, and fields, visible, unavoidable, and ever-present. People did not fear death because it was unknown. They feared it because they knew it intimately. Bodies were everywhere, graveyards overflowed, plagues resurfaced cyclically, wars swept through regions with little warning, and there was no illusion of safety. Death came from infection, childbirth, hunger, violence, accidents, and despair. Medical intervention was limited, pain relief was almost non-existent. Dying was rarely peaceful. The most terrifying aspect of medieval death was not mortality itself. It was how little control people had over it. Childbirth was among the leading causes of death for women. There were no antiseptics, no anesthesia, no understanding of germ theory. Midwives relied on experience, superstition, and prayer. Many mothers did not survive their first pregnancy. Many infants never took their first breath. Death was expected but not accepted. Grief was constant. Families buried children with disturbing frequency. Parents learned not to name infants too quickly. Emotional detachment became a survival strategy. To love deeply was to invite unbearable loss. Plagues intensified this reality. The Black Death did not merely kill, it rewired society's relationship with existence. At its peak, entire villages vanished. Clergy died faster than they could administer last rites. Mass graves replaced individual burials, and when death overwhelmed ritual, meaning collapsed. People searched for explanations: God's punishment, astrological alignment, foreigners, Jews, witches. Blame became contagious. Violence followed fear. The church offered answers, but also amplified terror. Heaven and hell were not abstract. They were detailed, graphic, immediate. Death was not an end. It was judgment. The fear of dying unconfessed or unrepentant haunted medieval minds. Sudden death was especially horrifying, not because of pain, but because it denied spiritual preparation. People lived in constant moral anxiety, not just about living well, but about dying correctly. Funeral rituals were elaborate not out of respect, but out of desperation. The dead needed proper passage. Improper burial risked haunting, curse, or damnation. Ghosts were not metaphors, they were social expectations. The boundary between the living and the dead was porous. Relics were venerated, bones were displayed, skulls became devotional objects. Death was integrated into daily life. Art reflected this obsession. The Danse Macabre depicted skeletons leading kings and peasants alike to the grave, reminding everyone that death ignored hierarchy. Yet in reality, hierarchy still mattered. The wealthy died with rituals. The poor died anonymously. Mass death normalized suffering but distorted empathy. People learned to endure loss without protest. And this endurance became a political resource. A population accustomed to death is easier to govern. Fear numbs resistance, but living surrounded by death left scars. Psychological trauma had no language. There was no concept of grief counseling. Pain was internalized, passed down. This constant proximity to death shaped medieval values deeply. Honor mattered because life was fragile. Reputation mattered because memory outlasted flesh. Faith mattered because chaos demanded explanation. But death also bred recklessness. If life was cheap, so was violence. Wars were fought with shocking brutality. Civilians were collateral without apology. Yet even in this darkness, something strange occurred. Communities formed deeper bonds. Shared suffering created solidarity. Because when death is everywhere, survival becomes collective. In the next chapter, we explore the institution that claimed to bring meaning to this suffering, the church, and how faith became both refuge and weapon. In medieval Europe, God was everywhere, not as comfort alone, but as surveillance. Faith was not a private belief. It was a public system of discipline. The church did not simply explain the world. It organized fear, structured obedience, and translated chaos into authority. For the medieval mind, God was not distant or abstract. He was immediate, watching, judging. Every illness carried moral meaning. Every disaster implied sin. Every success hinted at divine favor. Nothing was neutral. The church became the interpreter of reality itself. If crops failed, the church explained why. If plague struck, the church named the cause. If war erupted, the church justified it. To question these explanations was not intellectual disagreement. It was spiritual rebellion. Guilt was the primary currency. Not guilt for actions alone, but guilt for thoughts, doubts, desires. People were taught that sin was internal before it was external, and that made self-policing inevitable. Confession institutionalized this process. It was not merely spiritual cleansing, it was psychological exposure. Individuals disclosed their inner lives to authority figures who recorded, categorized, and judged them. This created a population trained to confess before being accused. Salvation was conditional. Grace was mediated. The church controlled access to forgiveness, burial, sacraments, and memory. To be excommunicated was to be erased from society, from protection, from meaning. Fear of hell was not symbolic. It was detailed, graphic, and constant. Church art depicted torture with anatomical precision. Sermons described eternal suffering in sensory terms. Hell was not imagined, it was rehearsed. Heaven, by contrast, was distant and conditional. Few believed they were destined for it. Most hoped merely to suffer less. This imbalance shaped behavior profoundly. Obedience became safer than virtue. Ritual replaced morality. Pilgrimages, indulgences, relics, these were not spiritual curiosities. They were transactional tools. Salvation could be negotiated, and those with wealth had leverage. The poor paid in devotion, the rich paid in coin, both paid in fear. Yet the church also provided real refuge. Hospitals, charity, literacy, and community all flowed through ecclesiastical institutions. For many, the church was the only stable structure in a violent world. This duality made resistance difficult. To oppose the church was to risk losing not just faith, but food, shelter, and social identity. Even kings bent the knee, because legitimacy flowed downward from God through the church to the crown. Power was vertical, and the church sat at the apex. But where there is total authority, there is inevitable corruption. Positions were sold, offices inherited, doctrines adjusted for convenience. And when contradictions grew too obvious, enforcement intensified. Heresy was not disagreement, it was contagion. Ideas were treated like disease, and the cure was elimination. This mindset would soon justify inquisitions, purges, and executions, not as cruelty, but as mercy, because destroying the body was framed as saving the soul. This is the darkest truth of medieval faith. Suffering was not an unfortunate byproduct. It was a feature. Pain proved devotion, endurance proved worthiness, and those who questioned this logic would soon discover what happened when belief turned violent. In the next chapter, we descend into the machinery that enforced spiritual conformity. The Inquisition, heresy, and the terror of thinking differently. In the medieval world, thought was not free. It was regulated. Belief was not a personal journey toward truth. It was a territory guarded by force. And when ideas crossed invisible boundaries, punishment followed. Heresy was not merely disagreement with doctrine, it was treason against reality itself. To the medieval church, truth was singular, fixed, and divinely revealed. Alternative interpretations were not perspectives, they were threats. This is where belief turned lethal. The Inquisition did not emerge suddenly as cruelty, it emerged as logic. If God's truth was absolute, if souls were eternal, if error led to damnation, then eliminating false belief became an act of mercy. That is how violence was moralized. The Inquisition was not a single institution, but a method, a system of investigation, accusation, interrogation, and punishment designed to eradicate deviation. Its power lay not in public executions alone, but in fear. Fear of neighbors, fear of words, fear of curiosity. Anyone could accuse anyone. Suspicion replaced trust. Silence became survival. Trials did not operate under modern standards of evidence. Confession was the ultimate proof, and confession was often extracted through pain. Torture was not considered cruelty. It was considered a tool of revelation. The body was broken to expose the soul. Sleep deprivation, strappado, crushing weights, fire without flame. Each method designed not just to cause pain, but to produce compliance. Many confessed to crimes they did not understand. Others invented beliefs they had never held. Because the goal was not truth, it was submission. Public punishment followed. Burnings were theatrical. They were meant to instruct. The crowd did not gather to question authority. They gathered to witness certainty, to be reminded of the cost of thinking incorrectly. The smell of burning flesh was not incidental. It was a warning encoded into memory. Entire communities adjusted behavior accordingly. Books were hidden, conversations shortened, questions swallowed, education narrowed. Curiosity became dangerous. This repression did not eliminate alternative ideas. It forced them underground. Secret traditions formed. Folk practices survived in whispers. Unofficial healers, midwives, mystics, and herbalists carried knowledge that predated church authority, and many of them were targeted, especially women. A woman with knowledge was suspicious. A woman without supervision was dangerous. A woman who healed without prayer was heretical. The seeds of later witch hunts were planted here. But the Inquisition also targeted intellectuals, scholars who questioned cosmology, clerics who interpreted scripture differently, thinkers who applied reason where obedience was expected. Ideas themselves became contraband. This created a paradox. The church preserved knowledge, while simultaneously suffocating it. Monasteries copied ancient texts, yet discouraged innovation. Universities taught logic, yet forbade conclusions. Progress slowed, not because people lacked intelligence, but because intelligence was constrained. The medieval mind learned to think sideways. Metaphor replaced statement. Allegory replaced argument. Art spoke where language could not. Truth hid in stories, in symbols, in silence. This culture of fear shaped Europe for centuries. It delayed scientific advancement. It entrenched authority. It normalized suffering as virtue. But pressure always creates resistance. And the same systems that enforced conformity also produced cracks. Because once belief becomes enforced by pain, it loses legitimacy. The Inquisition succeeded in silencing voices, but it failed to kill doubt. And doubt, once awakened, never truly dies. In the next chapter, we follow that doubt into darker territory, where fear, superstition, and desperation converged. In the medieval world, faith promised order, but there came a moment when order collapsed, and no prayer could hold it together. It began not with war, nor with kings, but with something far smaller, a bacterium carried by fleas, hidden in the fur of rats, moving silently along trade routes that once symbolized prosperity. When the Black Death arrived, medieval society was unprepared, not medically, not psychologically, not spiritually. Because this was not just a disease, it was an existential catastrophe. Villages vanished in weeks. Cities emptied in days. Entire bloodlines ended in a single season. 1/3 of Europe died. Some regions lost more than half their population. There was no explanation that made sense. Doctors blamed bad air. Astrologers blamed the stars. Priests blamed sin. No one could stop it. The church, which claimed dominion over life and death, stood powerless. And that silence was louder than any sermon. People prayed harder. They prayed incorrectly. They prayed until their knees bled, and still the dead piled higher. Bodies filled churches meant for worship. Mass graves replaced cemeteries. Rituals were shortened, then abandoned entirely. The sacred calendar broke. Time itself felt unstable. Fear did not remain private. It turned outward. If God was punishing humanity, then someone must be responsible. And medieval society was already trained to look for enemies. Jews were accused of poisoning wells. Foreigners were accused of carrying curses. The poor were accused of attracting God's wrath. Women were accused of witchcraft. Entire communities were massacred, not by disease, but by panic. Scapegoating became a survival instinct. Flagellant movements emerged. Men marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public. They believed pain could appease God. That blood could cleanse blood. Crowds gathered not to stop them, but to join them, because suffering felt like action. Meanwhile, medicine failed catastrophically. Doctors wore beaked masks filled with herbs, believing scent could block death. Bloodletting weakened patients already dying. Remedies killed as often as they healed. Knowledge reached its limits, and when knowledge fails, superstition expands. Amulets were sold. Relics were paraded. False cures spread faster than the disease itself. But beneath the terror, something profound shifted. For the first time, medieval people began to question the moral structure of the universe. Why did children die before sinners? Why did priests die alongside peasants? Why did prayer not protect the faithful? The idea that God rewarded virtue and punished sin no longer aligned with reality. Faith did not disappear, but certainty did. Death became intimate, unavoidable, democratic. The illusion of control shattered, and with it, the medieval worldview cracked open. Labor systems collapsed. There were suddenly too few workers. Survivors demanded wages. Serfs fled estates. Feudal contracts unraveled. For the first time, common people gained leverage, and the ruling class noticed. Authorities tried to freeze wages by law. They tried to force peasants back into submission, but the old order could not be fully restored. Too many had seen how fragile power truly was. Art changed. Death dominated imagery. Skeletons danced with kings. Grim reapers replaced angels. The dance of death was not metaphor, it was memory. Literature grew darker, more honest, more human, and beneath the despair, a dangerous idea took root. If God was not intervening, if authority could not protect, then perhaps meaning had to be constructed, not inherited. This idea terrified institutions because it did not need permission. The plague did not end medieval cruelty, but it exposed its foundations. It showed that suffering was not always deserved, that power was not divine, that certainty was a luxury, and from that realization something irreversible began. The medieval world did not collapse overnight, but after the plague, it was never whole again. In the next chapter, we follow what happens when fear lingers after catastrophe, when society seeks control by turning suspicion into policy. When the plague receded, fear did not. It changed shape. The medieval world emerged wounded, destabilized, and searching for control. Certainty had collapsed. Faith had faltered. Authority had been exposed as fragile. And when societies lose certainty, they do not become rational. They become dangerous. Fear demanded an enemy it could see, and medieval Europe chose one it could punish. The witch was not born from evidence. She was born from anxiety. Contrary to popular myth, medieval people did not suddenly discover witchcraft. Folk magic had existed for centuries. Midwives delivered children. Herbalists treated illness. Wise women preserved oral knowledge older than the church itself. They were tolerated until crisis made tolerance impossible. After the plague, survival instincts hardened. Anything unexplained became suspicious. Anything uncontrolled became threatening. And knowledge held by women outside church authority was intolerable. The witch was defined not by what she did, but by what she represented: autonomy, memory, power without permission. The church and secular authorities did not invent witch hunts out of superstition alone. They weaponized them as social discipline. Texts like Malleus Maleficarum reframed fear into doctrine. They taught judges how to identify witches. They taught priests how to justify cruelty. They taught society how to believe that evil wore a human face. Women were declared spiritually weaker, more susceptible to temptation, more likely to serve darkness. This was theology shaped by fear, not truth. Accusations spread rapidly. A failed harvest, a sick child, a stillbirth. Someone had to be responsible. And once accused, innocence became irrelevant. Trials were spectacles. Evidence was optional. Confession was mandatory. Torture transformed fantasy into testimony. Women confessed to flying, to shape-shifting, to dancing with demons, not because they believed it, but because pain makes imagination obedient. Neighbors testified against neighbors. Old grudges resurfaced as holy duty. Personal resentment was baptized as righteousness. Entire villages participated, not because everyone believed, but because everyone was afraid. The witch hunts did not target power. They targeted vulnerability. Widows, poor women, unmarried women, outspoken women, women who lived alone. The punishment was public: burning, hanging, drowning, not just execution, but instruction. This is what happens to those who exist outside control. Men were accused too, but rarely, and often only when they were associated with female networks of knowledge. The witch hunts were not about magic. They were about order. At the same time, women's roles narrowed. Midwifery was regulated. Healing required licenses. Knowledge moved from hands to institutions. Medicine became male. Religion became more centralized. Authority hardened. The witch hunts lasted centuries. They peaked not in the Dark Ages, but during periods of transition. Moments when old systems died and new ones were not yet trusted. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Millions died, not because of spells, but because society chose control over compassion, and yet resistance persisted, quietly, in lullabies, in remedies, in stories told to daughters. The knowledge did not vanish. It went underground. The witch became a symbol long after the fires cooled, a reminder of what happens when fear governs truth. The medieval world believed it was fighting evil. In reality, it was fighting its own reflection. In the next chapter, we examine another hidden cruelty, one practiced daily, quietly, without fire or spectacle. In medieval society, childhood was not protected. It was endured. There was no clear boundary between child and adult, only size. From the moment a child could walk, they were expected to work. From the moment they could understand commands, they were expected to obey. From the moment they disobeyed, they were punished. Love existed, but it was filtered through survival. Infant mortality was staggering. Many parents did not name children immediately. Attachment was delayed, not out of cruelty, but caution. To love too early was to invite grief. Those who survived infancy were quickly absorbed into labor. Fields, workshops, kitchens, stables. Play was not considered essential. It was considered wasteful. Education, when available, was harsh. Discipline relied on fear. Beatings were not abuse. They were instruction. The prevailing belief was simple. Pain corrected behavior. Suffering built character. Obedience ensured salvation. Parents were told that sparing the rod endangered the soul. Clergy preached discipline as love. Children learned quickly where power resided, not in fairness, not in explanation, but in force. Schools mirrored monasteries: silence, repetition, punishment. Learning was rote, curiosity was suspect, mistakes were sins, and sins demanded correction. This created adults trained to accept suffering, trained to obey hierarchy, trained to normalize cruelty. Emotional expression was discouraged. Crying was weakness. Fear was failure. Questions were defiance. Children learned to internalize authority, to police themselves. The body became a tool. The will became something to break. Apprenticeships were equally brutal. Young boys were beaten by masters, humiliated publicly, worked to exhaustion. Girls were trained for obedience in the home. Marriage often followed adolescence. Consent was irrelevant. Girls became wives before they understood childhood. Boys became laborers before they understood freedom. Abuse was not hidden. It was institutional. Religion reinforced it. Children were taught they were born sinful, that their instincts were corrupt, that their nature required correction. The concept of childhood innocence did not exist as we know it. Children were miniature adults with inferior self-control, and so pain was justified. Yet children are observant. They absorb more than they understand. They learned who held power, who could be trusted, who could not. Many carried trauma into adulthood, but trauma was not named. It was normalized. And normalized pain creates compliant societies. There were moments of tenderness, songs, stories, games stolen between chores. Parents loved their children, but love was constrained by a world that demanded hardness. To survive medieval life, softness was dangerous. This legacy endured. Generations raised in fear raised children the same way. The cycle repeated, but something subtle began to shift. As the medieval era waned, philosophers questioned whether pain truly taught virtue. Humanist ideas whispered that children were not broken adults, but developing humans. These ideas were fragile, but they planted seeds. Because when a society accepts suffering as normal, it becomes blind to injustice. The treatment of children reveals a civilization's values, and medieval values were forged in scarcity, fear, and authority. In the final chapter, we step back from daily cruelty to see the larger picture, how all these systems intertwined, and why medieval life was not merely harsh, but deliberately structured to be so. By the end of the medieval era, suffering had become invisible, not because it was rare, but because it was everywhere. Medieval life was not chaotic by accident. It was engineered through systems that rewarded obedience, normalized pain, and preserved power. Every institution reinforced the next. The church defined truth. The crown enforced order. The manor controlled labor. The family disciplined the young. Together they formed a closed loop. People were not meant to escape this world. They were meant to endure it. Scarcity was not only economic, it was psychological. Hope was postponed to the afterlife. Justice was deferred to God. Meaning was promised later, never now. This belief structure allowed extreme inequality to persist without constant rebellion. If suffering was divinely ordained, resistance became sin. And so medieval society survived for centuries, not because it was kind, but because it was stable. Yet stability has a cost. Innovation slowed, empathy narrowed, human potential was compressed into rigid roles. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, never questioning whether life could be different. But cracks began to appear. Trade expanded, cities grew, plagues shattered certainty. The Black Death did what sermons never could. It exposed the fragility of divine explanations. When priests died alongside peasants, when prayers failed equally, people began to question, if God governed everything, why did chaos rule so often? Labor shortages gave workers leverage. Feudal bonds weakened. The unthinkable became possible. Slowly, painfully, medieval life began to unravel. New ideas emerged. Humanism, individual worth, secular learning. Childhood began to be seen as formative, not defective. Pain as a teacher was questioned. Authority required justification. These shifts did not erase suffering, but they changed how it was understood. The medieval world did not end in fire. It dissolved. Its systems lingered long after its castles crumbled. Even today, echoes remain. In work cultures that glorify exhaustion, in education that punishes curiosity, in beliefs that suffering equals virtue, the medieval mindset did not disappear, it evolved. Understanding medieval life is not about judging the past. It is about recognizing patterns, because when hardship is framed as normal, injustice hides easily. The people of the medieval world were not ignorant. They were constrained. They were resilient. They were human. They loved. They hoped. They feared, just like us. But their world taught them one lesson above all. Survival mattered more than happiness, and that lesson shaped centuries. To study medieval life honestly is to confront an uncomfortable truth, that civilization does not always progress toward kindness. Sometimes it progresses toward efficiency. And the question every generation must answer is this: what kind of world are we building now? Because the structures we normalize today will define how future generations endure tomorrow. By the height of the medieval world, cruelty was no longer questioned. It was organized. What looks like chaos from a distance was, in truth, a carefully balanced system, a system where every class understood its limits and rarely crossed them. Medieval society survived not because it was humane, but because it was predictable. Power flowed downward in rigid lines: God to church, church to crown, crown to lord, lord to peasant, parent to child. Each layer enforced the next, not always through violence, but through belief. People were taught that hierarchy reflected divine order. To challenge it was to challenge God himself. This belief removed the need for constant force. Most people disciplined themselves. Fear became internal. Laws were brutal, but rarely needed. Punishments were public to remind everyone watching that order had teeth. A single execution could silence an entire village. A single flogging could shape a generation. Justice was not about fairness. It was about deterrence. Medieval courts favored confession over truth. Pain extracted obedience. Silence protected power. The poor had few rights. The rich had few limits. Yet this imbalance was framed as natural, necessary, even merciful. The church taught that suffering purified the soul, that endurance earned eternal reward, that injustice on earth would be corrected in heaven. This belief allowed unbearable conditions to persist. Why revolt when salvation waited beyond death? The economy relied on this acceptance. Feudal labor was extracted through obligation, not wages. Peasants worked land they would never own, paid taxes they could barely afford. Hunger was seasonal, so was hope. Famines returned with frightening regularity, and when food vanished, so did compassion. The weak died first, the strong endured, and survival was mistaken for virtue. Medical knowledge was limited, disease was moralized, illness seen as punishment. Hospitals existed, but healing was secondary to prayer. Pain was endured, not alleviated. Women bore the heaviest burden. They worked, they birthed, they obeyed. Pregnancy was constant. Death in childbirth was common. But questioning this fate was forbidden. Even joy was regulated. Festivals were rare. Laughter was suspect. Excess emotion hinted at sin. Life was not meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to be survived correctly. And yet, within this rigid order, humanity persisted. People loved deeply. Families bonded fiercely. Communities supported one another quietly. Small kindnesses mattered. Shared bread, a hidden smile, a whispered prayer not for heaven, but for tomorrow. These moments kept medieval life from collapsing entirely, but they did not change the system. The medieval world endured because it suppressed alternatives. New ideas were dangerous, difference was threatening, change was feared, and so the system held, until forces beyond control began to fracture it. Plague, trade, education, curiosity. The very rigidity that preserved medieval society would become its weakness, because a world built entirely on endurance cannot adapt forever. In the next chapter, we confront the breaking point, when death arrived on a scale so vast that faith, hierarchy, and certainty began to crack. It did not arrive like an enemy army. There was no warning horn, no battlefield, no chance to prepare. Death arrived quietly, on merchant ships, along trade roads, inside warm bodies that showed no sign of danger until they collapsed. The medieval world had survived famine, it had survived war, it had survived cruelty, but it was not prepared for mass death without meaning. When the Black Death spread across Europe, it shattered more than bodies. It shattered certainty. Villages vanished in weeks, cities fell silent, fields went unplanted. 1/3 of the population died, in some places half. There were not enough living to bury the dead. Graves filled. Church bells rang until no one was left to pull the rope. Priests died giving last rites. Doctors died treating patients. Families died together. And for the first time, medieval people noticed something terrifying. Faith did not protect the faithful. The righteous died beside the wicked, the devout beside the sinful, children beside kings. Prayers failed equally. The old explanations collapsed. If suffering purified the soul, why were the pure destroyed? If hierarchy reflected divine order, why did God erase entire towns? Some clung harder to belief. Flagellants marched through streets, whipping their own flesh, hoping pain would appease heaven. Others turned desperate. Scapegoats were hunted. Minorities blamed. Jews massacred. Women accused of witchcraft. Fear demanded someone to punish. But beneath the chaos, something else was happening. Power was leaking. With so many dead, labor became precious. Peasants realized their value. For the first time, lords needed workers more than workers needed lords. Wages rose. Demands were made. Refusals followed. The rigid medieval hierarchy began to bend. The church, once unquestioned, faltered. Its authority weakened by its inability to explain or stop the plague. People still believed in God, but they trusted institutions less. Death had leveled society, and equality, even temporary, is dangerous to rigid systems. Survivors saw opportunity where once there was only endurance. They inherited land, they moved cities, they changed trades. The medieval mindset, built on acceptance, was cracking. Education spread, books circulated, questions grew louder. Why should suffering be normal? Why should birth determine destiny? Why should authority go unquestioned? These were not revolutions yet, they were whispers, but whispers survive when screams do not. The plague did not end medieval life overnight, but it poisoned its foundations. A world built on obedience cannot survive mass doubt. Death had rewritten the rules, and the survivors knew deep down that life could never return to what it was. In the next chapter, we follow what emerged from the ruins, how new ideas, new fears, and new ambitions began to reshape the medieval mind itself. The world did not change all at once. It hesitated. After the plague, medieval society tried to return to order, but the old order no longer fit. People remembered what it felt like when hierarchy collapsed, when a peasant's labor mattered, when survival depended on cooperation, not rank. Those memories could not be erased. Lords attempted to freeze wages. Kings issued laws to restore obedience. The church tightened doctrine, but authority now felt fragile. People had seen too much death to fear threats as deeply as before. Ideas began to move faster than armies. Trade routes became knowledge routes. Cities became laboratories of thought. Merchants gained power not through blood, but wealth. Craftsmen gained respect through skill, not birth. Education shifted, not away from religion, but toward observation. People began to study the natural world, not just scripture. Medicine slowly separated illness from sin. Astronomy challenged Earth's central place. History began to record human causes, not just divine will. This was dangerous thinking. The medieval worldview depended on fixed meaning, a world where everything had its place. Questioning one belief threatened them all. The church responded with trials. Heresy became crime. Fear returned, but it felt different. People were no longer afraid only of hell. They were afraid of knowledge. Witch hunts intensified. Women, especially those with knowledge of healing, were targeted. Control tightened as certainty weakened, but repression could not stop curiosity. Printing transformed thought. Books reached people who had never held power. Ideas escaped walls. The medieval mind, once anchored in obedience, began to fracture into individuality. People started asking, who am I? What do I deserve? What is truth? These questions were revolutionary. The shift was not clean. Progress walked beside violence, hope alongside fear. Old beliefs died slowly, some violently, and yet humanity was expanding beyond endurance. Life began to be measured not just by survival, but by meaning. This transition was messy, painful, and incomplete, but it was irreversible. The medieval world was ending, not because it failed, but because it could no longer contain the human spirit it had suppressed. In the next chapter, we confront the final transformation, how medieval suffering shaped the modern world more than we realize. The Middle Ages did not end, they dissolved, and what remained never truly disappeared. Modern society likes to imagine a clean break, a sudden awakening, a bright dawn called progress. But history does not work that way. The medieval world didn't vanish. It seeped into us. Our cities may rise in steel and glass, but their foundations were poured in stone, laid by medieval hands. The streets we walk, the laws we follow, the fears we inherit, all carry medieval fingerprints. Consider authority. We still obey systems we rarely see. Institutions with symbolic power, titles that command respect before understanding. That structure was perfected in the Middle Ages. Kings ruled by divine right, churches ruled by moral authority, guilds controlled labor, nobles controlled land. Replace crown with corporation, replace cathedral with ideology. The hierarchy remains. Even our justice systems echo medieval logic, public punishment, moral spectacle. Guilt performed before society. Shame is still a tool. Fear still maintains order. The medieval obsession with purity never left either. It simply changed form. Once it was religious purity, now it's ideological. Once heresy was punished by fire, now it's punished by exile from communities, careers, reputations. Different methods, same instinct. Look at labor. Medieval peasants worked endlessly to survive. Modern workers do the same, different chains, same exhaustion. The promise changed, the pressure didn't. Even our relationship with time is medieval. Productivity defines worth. Idleness invites guilt. Rest must be earned. And then there is fear of the unknown. In the Middle Ages, monsters lived beyond the map. Today, danger lives in uncertainty, economic collapse, technological displacement, invisible threats. We are still haunted by unseen forces. The medieval mind lived under constant crisis, plague, war, famine. So does ours. Only the names have changed. Perhaps the most haunting legacy is how suffering became normalized. Medieval people learned to endure. So did we. Pain became routine, hardship expected, stability rare. We inherited that endurance without questioning whether suffering should still be necessary. Yet the Middle Ages also gave us something else: community. People survived together or not at all. Mutual dependence was reality. We lost that. Modern life celebrates independence, but isolation has costs. Medieval people feared death. We fear loneliness. Their world was brutal. Ours is quiet. Both are dangerous in different ways. The medieval era was not darkness alone. It was preparation, a long, painful training for complexity. Every law, system, and structure we live under was forged through medieval failure. We are not superior to the past. We are shaped by it. The question is not whether medieval life still influences us. It is whether we recognize it. Because the final chapter of this story is not history, it is now. And in the last part, we confront the ultimate truth. What medieval life reveals about who we are and who we might become. The Middle Ages were never meant to be remembered as they truly were. They were simplified, sanitized, reduced to castles, knights, and candles. But beneath the imagery was a long, difficult lesson about being human. Medieval life was not a failure of intelligence. It was a test of endurance. People lived without certainty, without safety nets, without guarantees that tomorrow would arrive. And yet civilization did not collapse. It adapted. The Middle Ages taught humanity how to survive inside systems it did not choose, how to find meaning when freedom was limited, how to build identity under constant pressure, how to endure loss without losing purpose. That lesson still matters because modern life, for all its technology, offers fewer certainties than we admit. We still live under systems larger than ourselves. We still measure worth through productivity. We still struggle to balance obedience and individuality. The medieval world reveals something uncomfortable. Progress does not erase human nature, it rearranges it. Fear did not vanish. Power did not disappear. Suffering did not end. They simply learned to wear new disguises, but the Middle Ages also left behind quiet wisdom, community over isolation, shared survival over individual glory, rituals that gave meaning to hardship. People prayed not because they were ignorant, but because hope was necessary. They told stories because memory mattered. They gathered because alone was dangerous. In many ways, medieval people understood something we often forget. A society survives not on strength alone, but on cohesion. They endured darkness without believing it was permanent, and that may be their greatest gift to us. The Middle Ages remind us that even in brutal conditions, human beings continue to love, to create, to believe, to endure. History does not move in straight lines. It circles. What we call dark was often simply difficult. What we call primitive was often resilient. And what we call past is still speaking to us quietly, persistently through the structures of our lives. The Middle Ages were not a warning. They were a mirror. And if we are willing to look into it honestly, we might finally understand that the true darkness is not in history, but in forgetting what it took to survive it.